Hello and welcome to Property Question Time. I'm Stephen Galpin and this is a show where you can have your property related questions answered by our team of experts. And joining me today is Zee Razaq, Managing Director of Certax Accounting in St Albans. Welcome to you, Zee.
Thank you for having us again, Stephen.
Good to have you back. And we have somebody today who's doing their first Property Question Time, Vivek Brahmbhatt, property agent, consultant and partner at Robinson Marsh. Welcome to you.
Thank you very much, Stephen. Pleasure.
Good. Well, at least you've not had too far to travel today, have you? I think
Across the hallway?
50 yards? Yeah, it's great stuff. All right, well, jolly good. Good to have you here anyway. So, Zee, you're going to go first. What incentives to business would the experts like to see the government introduce to assist in keeping the property market, and specifically the provision of new homes, from stalling? Is a change in taxation structure and stamp duty reductions actually the answer?
Really good question. And as you know, with the financial situation that we're in the UK economy and probably across the world, but especially the UK, a lot of things going on. And I think we unpack that because there's a few elements to that. First of all, the changes in tax, just for the audiences, you've had stamp duty, land tax thresholds increase for first-time buyers and people buying the additional property. Has that really helped? Maybe a little bit. The incentive's not that much, but I think the bigger challenges around the tax on companies that's going to increase and personal tax. So when you're looking at the incentive side, you've got to look. Normally, historically, they used to get it balanced. That has not happened, and that's where I think I'm quite disappointed, and many people in the industry are disappointed. So from a property perspective, when we used to incentivize, we used to look at capital allowances. So one of the incentivizations was the super deduction, and that has not been extended apart from 31st of March 2023. So these are the things where I felt the government would, even though if they're increasing tax, incentivize people to invest in the economy. But it was a very single-sided budget from my perspective, or from my looking at.
But look, as if I use your expression, if I may, sort of let's just unpack the question a little bit and how you arrive at an answer. You're an accountant, you advise businesses, you create strategies. I'm presuming that the Treasury give you some kind of advance notice of what they're thinking or what the process is likely to be, even if it's sort of embargoed and you're not allowed to say anything to anybody. I don't know whether that happens or not. But I'm just struggling these days to understand how a business can make plans when the government seems to be going from left to right, you know, at a rapid rate of knots. How do you cope with it? How do you advise?
Really good question. There's two parts to that. One, do we get prior knowledge? No. We do get some aspects of it when we're trying to have discussions about implementation, and this comes through the major accountancy organizations that have discussions, but it's normally when something's gone wrong. So that's first of all. Secondly,
or they're lost on how to implement it. Yeah.
And this happens quite a lot because they don't always think it through, and that's how I've been challenged, especially when they're trying to get a bit too clever how they're implementing stuff. Number two, which is a really good, how do we plan? This is the biggest challenge, and this is where we're speaking to business owners and they're like, 1 month it's this, 1 month's that. So we have to start looking at the underlying position of where things are going. If we know taxes are going to rise, we have to then think about what can we implement to make sure we minimize the tax position. That's where those strategies tend to be quite wise, how you do them, and smart, and that makes the big difference. If you don't do them, you're going to have problems.
But obviously there's not. I mean, what taxation strategy you're advising or putting into place is probably going to work in the year after this one or whatever else. And again, if the policy starts changing more than once in that year, you've had it, haven't you? Really
good point. I think it comes down to whether they're implementing it on the day of the budget, because that's what they've been doing historically, or are they waiting until the new tax year or following tax years? In the last one recently, that's been spread over those 3 areas. So you have to deal with the strategy and how that impact is. So I'll give you an example. They've changed the annual exemption for capital gains tax. Yep. People are like, Zee, what do you mean by that? When I sell a property, I get like a tax-free allowance for capital gains tax. That's the first time they've reduced it in living memory, and it's been frozen for so many years. So it's like a double whammy. So what I'm having a lot of property investors, especially, get in contact and saying, Zee, should we be selling this property before April 2023 when they start halving the allowance? It's currently 12,300. It's going to drop to 6,000, then 3,000 the following year, which is not great for the investor. And you've got to think strategies how we use those now, because it could be a significant difference.
Can
in
I
your
check
tax
in
bill.
on that?
Yeah.
Just confirm when that was, when that legislation came in. Was it sort of pre 2019, around then, 2020?
No, this is what was announced
Literally
in
just
the
yeah.
recent budget.
And so with regard to some changes, though, I recall some of my investors who are sort of, they have heavily unencumbered portfolios. So what they had been doing is literally deleveraging, and in order not to be stung with high levels of capital gains over like the last 4 years. So that's why I was wondering, was it in the most recent budget, or was this a couple of years back? Because I remember there were some major changes or a bit of a shake-up to capital tax legislation or capital gains legislation, and the implications on vendors or landlords who, especially if they were unencumbered properties, more than likely they've owned the properties for a number of years, 30, 40, 50 years, having picked them up at peanuts at the rates we sort of see today. And so they've sort of been offloading 1, 2, 3 units every year. And that's just something I've noticed. Like you were saying, you've got landlords or investors asking you this even now off the back of the most recent budget. But I think it has been a way by which, it's putting off certain long-term landlords who have built up, quite large unencumbered, or not even just unencumbered, quite large resi or commercial / resi portfolios. And they're sort of not wanting to leave the headache for the next generation, or if they were to pass it on, even with regard to inheritance tax law changes, and hence why they're sort of choosing to sell, deal with everything now while they're still here, and then pass anything on in terms of monetary value to their children or other family members.
I'll unpack your answer, because that's quite a lot of information, and it's really useful with the investors' train of thought. There's 3 parts to that. The first part is the tax on interest, i.e. income tax. So that's what's happened where people have got leverage. It's costing them more from a cash flow compared to a tax perspective, so that it's causing them a lot of problems. That's the first part. The second part, you talked about capital gains tax. The major change was people who had their own home, how that's been taxed, or was a previous main residence. And the third part is the exit, if it is unfortunately they pass away, i.e. inheritance tax. That is always been a big issue, and managing that is so important. So people in their own name compared to a company, there's a big difference. So there's 3 major parts, and I think as most investors, they don't see it probably like ourselves.
Right, Vivek, your question. Canary Wharf and the other areas of London, for example, Tower Bridge, have been hugely successful areas of regeneration. However, to reach their full potential have taken more than 20 years to do so. Have the panel any tips on how to identify future areas of good development potential without having to look quite so long term? I mean, I'm thinking about when I first moved to London, they told me Commercial Road was going to be the thing, and I'm still waiting.
I think it still might be a while for Commercial Road, but however, saying that, you've been around Canary Wharf, or Isle of Dogs as it still is referred to, as well as like the Wapping sort of St Catherine's Dock area down to Tower Bridge, down to South Bank. And yes, it is apparent that there has been major regeneration and gentrification of these areas, even down towards King's Cross and further afield. But touching on Canary Wharf and in this locality, there were probably a handful of buildings that were in excess or higher than 20 stories, going back even as recent as the last 20 years. But 10 years ago, when Pan Peninsula and Landmark East and West Towers were the only 40, 50 story and above units that were in existence as residential blocks in this area. Over the past 10 years, however, we've seen an influx of multiple residential blocks that are in excess of 50 stories. And I think that type of living, that type of regeneration is a form of gentrification, because these skyscrapers cost anywhere in the region of you know, 5, 6, 700 million to sort of construct once they've acquired the land and got the planning, sat on it even for a number of years to get the planning that they require to make it a feasible project for the developer. And I think that's what we've seen, especially along this part of Canary Wharf, along Marsh Wall and South Quay.
But again, it's taken a long time, hasn't it?
Yes, and they do say Rome wasn't built in a day. But at the same time, I think when you've got the combination of jobs, demand, retail infrastructure, transport infrastructure, again, these are all factors that you need for the uplift, for the capital growth. You know, Canary Wharf, I remember when there was 5 shops here, there was no Jubilee line, for example. You know, the DLR was sort of the way around the Isle of Dogs, which again, back then was a very different place. However, now, and I've heard the term soulless, you know, been attached to Canary Wharf over the years. I'd like to sort of think, especially over the last sort of decade, that's going to be a label that has less attachment to the area, just where I think in terms of lifestyle or balance of lifestyle, work, retail, and even raising a family within a riverside location in quite a, you know, we're in zone 2 over here, hopefully that may be reclassified one day. But you've not really got anything else quite like this in any other part of London. No. An area where they've tried to replicate something similar, and they've probably spent the best part of £10 billion doing it, and a lot of money from, I believe, Singapore backing it, is the power station,
Battersea, yeah.
Where you've pretty much got, you know, something where you could even compare to the Wharf. And again, that's taken a decade to deliver.
I think you're right. I mean, I have to tell you, you know, 25 years ago, I did some work for the receivers on Canary Wharf when the bank said it'll never work.
Was that just before the Qataris came in and swooped in and picked it up?
Well before, when it was at Imperial York, yeah.
And so I think we've all sort of seen the change. I think what it holds in store is, off the back of Brexit, for me anyway, we saw people looking at investment of, you know, pre-launch, taking floors in some of these new high-rise towers that you see around us, to not wanting to touch the market just due to uncertainty. And for some people, that uncertainty obviously creates opportunity. For others who, you know, they may want to stay away and keep their money in the bank or look at alternative investment.
That's all we've got time for in this half of the show. So join me again after the break, when we'll be asking Viv and Zee more of your questions. Hello and welcome back to part 2 of Property Question Time with Vivek Brahmbhatt and Zee Razaq. Welcome back, guys. Zee, your second question. Do the panel think the government is positively trying to do away with the smaller buy-to-let investors, with the recent tax changes favouring ownership in limited companies and larger sort of institutional investment companies, I suppose?
Great question, Stephen. I think you've got to sort of break that into 2 parts. What's happening to people who are not in limited companies? 3 major things have happened. Stamp duty has gone up, obviously, previously, even though they've increased the bands recently, but it's still overall a negative impact for a small investor. Second bit is, when you've got the property, what taxes you're paying, the tax on interest. And thirdly, which is quite relevant, is exit, right? So when you sell a property, you had an annual exemption, which I think we were talking about before. That's reduced, so it's disincentivized people to own property in your own name. How has it become more incentive for a limited company? I think it's slightly more beneficial now for a limited company than it was before the recent announcements, but the structuring of the limited company is the big benefit for exit, i.e. inheritance tax, also the journey. But as we know, the government always change stuff, so corporation tax increase has actually sort of counteracted that.
Do you think for the smaller investor, do you think the cost of running and supporting a limited company has any actual benefit by the time you've done your cash flow and whatever else? Because, I mean, okay, as an individual, you're probably going to need the support of managing agents and various other people, and maybe rent guarantee costs and things like that, whereas perhaps in a limited company it could be a bit more structured.
There is, but you have to counter that with the savings. So if we just use one aspect, i.e. the tax on interest, right? And I'll give an example. If I was earning a job, I got 40,000 for my job, and my property income, less all the expenses, excluding mortgage interest, was 20,000, and the mortgage interest was 10,000, right? So if I add that up, 40 plus 20 equals 60. If you take the mortgage interest before the changes, it would have been 50,000 because you just deduct it. But now my income is based on 60,000 with a little tax credit. So what ends up happening is, if I got a 20% tax credit, I'm actually only getting a saving of £2,000, whereas before I was getting a saving of 4,000. But just by moving from your name to a company, you just saved 2,000 on your interest costs. So we can't, we have to look at the whole picture. Is there a benefit? And you can offset more stuff in a company, and is IHT planning more effective in a company than in your own name? So if I look at the journey and the exit, the company is more beneficial considerably now.
Okay. And if you're, again, a small individual investor, and you think, well, okay, this seems to be the way the government are pushing us, so I'll go with the flow, I'll convert into being a limited company and put some structure into what I'm doing. Is the cost of that prohibitive, or any downsides or upsides in doing that?
It really depends on your situation, what your costs are, what your income is, because you have to look at the overall tax position. So when it's in your own name, it's sometimes simplified, but it's quite costly. You just look at personal tax because you get taxed on no matter what your profit is. Or as we said, the cash flow aspects. Whereas where you've got a company, you've got to have a bit more understanding, because you have company tax, which is corporation tax, and then you have how you extract the money out, personal tax. So you have to add all those up, look at the overall
make sure you don't have a double taxation, I suppose, really, effectively.
Yeah, but if normally company tax and personal tax is actually ends up being more cost effective than just paying personal tax, funny enough, because of the changes in tax on interest. So when you weigh both of those up, then you get the result. That's why you need someone who understands property taxation and evaluation. Also, there's more offsets in a company than in your own name.
Yeah.
So you've got to take that into consideration. I hope that makes sense, what I'm trying to explain.
No, that makes sense. Have you come across this with your investors?
Yes, I most certainly have. And it was actually when I first started in the industry, met this chap who obviously said he's going to put me in touch with his boss, who owns a few properties, he told me, and literally sent the email he asked me to send, and I received a property list back for about 30 instructions, and they were only rentals, but at the time, paying a good fee, we were like, it's not too bad, it's quite good for the business. However, one thing I noticed, the landlord of these properties were obviously this group. However, on the information I had with regard to each address, and this is going back to sort of 2008, and I'm sure he had set this up well before that, was each entity had its own limited company as the owner or the landlord it was attached to. So say if it was number 10 Marsh Wall, the owner on paper or on land reg would be 10 Marsh Wall Ltd, for example, and this was across his whole portfolio. Came to light that one of his other partners was actually his accountant, and obviously I believe that would have helped. Well, he was sort of preempting any sort of taxes that he'd be sort of liable for, and he had structured it in a way where it would be of most benefit to him. And going back to the point that was just asked, and your feedback, that your answer there, I think the government are making it more difficult for the sort of smaller sort of investors or buy-to-let landlords who maybe have up to about half a dozen, 10 properties to sort of manage their taxes or their affairs without sort of overcomplicating things. Whereas someone who's in a position where they've got sort of 20 units or more, they're going to sort of seek advice wherever they can. And once they've set up that structure, they can then still be acquiring without having to worry about any new tax implications as such. I'm not saying they don't worry, but they'll address it as and when, because let's face it, there's a solution for every problem.
Okay, thank you for that, Zee. So Vivek, your next question. Has the opening of the Elizabeth line across London actually had any identifiable and upward trending values in associated areas of the cross-London route?
That's a fantastic question.
Right.
I think everyone was waiting for the Crossrail. Obviously, it was slightly overdue, but we got there in the end. I would say there have been definite growth spots across London, but the majority of the growth was taking place whilst everything was still under construction. There has been, visible growth in areas such as Canary Wharf, I'd say, even Greenwich, obviously, where they've put, another stop there, and they've built a whole new station, which has allowed that side of the river to obviously be linked up to this side, which, again, commuting from that side, from Greenwich into Canary Wharf, you'd have to maybe change, I think, on 1 or 2 DLRs, which would just add a little bit onto that journey time. And
Greenwich has always been a bit difficult, hasn't it, sort of commuter-wise?
Just where it's south of the river, well, connecting it up to this side after having Royal Borough status, I think it's just sort of definitely enhanced, sort of 2018 prices compared to 2014 prices. You can see light and day between them. You're probably talking like more than 30%, especially like the old Victorian properties down from Greenwich down to Blackheath. Demand for those has gone through the roof even now, because where else can you really pick up, I wouldn't even say affordable anymore, can't really refer to it as that, but affordable period Victorian properties within sort of a London postcode. Same with Canary Wharf to Liverpool Street, for example. It was a bit of a tricky, like logistically, it's less than 3 miles or 2 miles from here, but it was always a little bit tricky to travel or commute there. By having Crossrail sort of going via, the route it does back through to Liverpool Street and even Farringdon, it's just helped connectivity across the capital. And wherever that happens, especially where there's residential property, again with jobs, again with retail or commerce, it always seems to add capital growth over the years.
I think perhaps the idea where people look back over time and think, does it make a difference where the railways go? I mean, when we talk about Canary Wharf here, and you go back 25 years, I mean, there was no public transport here at all. And so when the DLR came along, it was wow, it was fantastic. But I think that was a bit of an exception, really, wasn't it? So I just don't think it actually works as a principle right across the city. I think you're right as well. Just to pick up that point on residential properties, in the City of London, not that much residential as you cross the city and go towards the West End. It's only when you get out towards Ealing or those sort of places that the residential builds up again, isn't it?
Yeah, and I think that's part of the reason why London also, especially Zone 1, prices are always, relatively, I'd say, I wouldn't say safe, but, for investors, it's always been, for global investors, it's always been a place where if they wanted to, invest in a solid, in something solid, they've always had decent returns, especially post-Olympics, where I think there was a bit of a slump. Obviously, we all were around 2007 to 2010, but the growth that I saw between sort of post-Olympics, 2012 to 2016 was, a great opportunity for new landlords or new investors to get into the market. Again, now I think you have to be even more careful, and it's about identifying where those areas are now, and again, buying at the right price. That's where you make your money.
Of course. All right, well, on that note, that's all we've got time for in today's show. So a big thank you to Vivek Brahmbhatt. Thank you very much for coming in.
Thank you.
And thank you, Zee, for coming in again. Both of you, very good answers, very helpful. I'm sure our viewers are most grateful. So I'm Stephen Galpin. Join me again next time on Property Question Time.